Hello. Thank you so much for joining this episode of the Enneagram and Marriage Pod. We're so thankful to have our guest, Raleigh Sadler, here today. Raleigh has a podcast, the MercyCast. He has a book called Vulnerable. We're going to talk with him today about how you can shift into that very thing, healthy vulnerability in relationships. And Raleigh has done so much work in this area, both personally, as you're going to get to hear some of his stories today, but also globally as he works so hard with his own organization, Let My People Go, in the fight against human trafficking. So I hope you will check out his wonderful pod, the MercyCast. I was so grateful to be a guest on the show. And recently I loved the episode with Jay Stringer. They talk in depth about sexuality and how you can fight that fight and remember what Christ has done for you. And there's just so much richness and depth that help us to walk in the past a little bit in order to heal the future. So I'm grateful and I am so thankful for this topic because we're always talking about vulnerability here. And yet there are places and spaces where, as we think of vulnerable populations, it's not always helpful or healthy to be vulnerable, right? So we're going to grapple with that today. We're going to talk about some of our own stories where we've been vulnerable, maybe too vulnerable, and have had to set our own boundaries or allow ourselves to walk out of shame and back into healthy light. And I'm just grateful you're here with us. I'm so happy you press play. If this is your Labor Day rest day, I hope you're enjoying it so much. I'm pre recording this a little bit, but also happy that I'm just here, also relaxing over the weekend largely. And some of you know, Wes was hurt, my husband, on a bike accident last week, a bicycle accident. So he's recovering well, but it has been quite a week. So thank you for prayers and kindness. And people have even sent him gifts and food. And I'm just so grateful. And he's feeling very loved. You know, he's very social. And you know what? It's exposing a vulnerability. So he's working on that too, because it's no fun to be down for the count for a little while. So thank you for praying. And he'll probably even be seeing patients this week, but virtually. So we'll see. But I just really appreciate you. And thank you for checking in with me on Instagram when we were sharing some of the stories of the crazy week. But we all get vulnerable sometimes like that, not by choice. Sometimes when we risk something and we say something to a friend and it's rejected, or they say something to us and they sort of trauma dumped on us and it felt too much for us and our bodies viscerally react. We're going to all these spaces today because we want to be healthily vulnerable. And I don't want you to be anything but authentic and growing better, but I want you to have some ideas for how to do that. So thanks for walking this journey. You can use this for friendships, for your ministry, for your outreach, for finding your gifts and sharing them, and also for knowing when to pull back and to rest and such. And of course, in your relationship with your spouse too. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let's talk to Raleigh now. Hey, Raleigh, I'm so excited to have you on the Enneagram and Marriage podcast. Thanks for coming.
No, thank you for having me.
This is going to be a great conversation. Our audience is eager to learn from you. Can you tell us about yourself and MercyCast and just a little bit about your personality type too?
Yeah, so my name is Raleigh Sadler. I started a nonprofit years ago called Let My People Go, and it was really born out of this desire to help vulnerable people, even though I didn't know what that meant at the time. I had been a pastor and my job was ending. And so, right around that time, one of my best friends was dying of cancer. And I think I was going through a breakup at the same time. So, there are all these things that were exposing my frailty. There are all these things that were exposing my issues and my brokenness and my pain and my fear and my anxiety. And all the while, I wanted to help other people. So, I got to a point, and I'm a person of faith, and so I got to a point where I remember praying to God and saying, "God, like, my friend who had everything going for him
Mm.
just died, and everything in the world is going against me, and I'm still around." And I was fine. I was okay. I was sad, but I wasn't having dark thoughts. It was just one of these things. I'm like, "God, you're not just you just don't seem to be logical."
Mm.
But it was that peeling back of all the things I held dear to. It was that peeling back of things that I depended on and went to for significance. As those things started going away, I started realizing like just where I was, when when things go away, oftentimes we're faced with reality, and we can either face that reality or we can run from it to the next thing, to the next distraction, to the next what have you. And I think for me, it was at that point of facing my vulnerability that my vision became very clear. And I decided I was going to sell everything I owned and move to New York to fight human trafficking, even though I didn't know what that meant
Wow.
at the time.
Wow.
And so that's when I started Let My People Go. And it began as this anti trafficking organization. And as it grew, I kind of realized that the crux of what we would do would be to help churches and faith communities care for vulnerable people themselves, not to do it as people who had it together, but realizing that our vulnerability is our superpower that connects us to everyone else. And so that sent me down a road that I never thought I'd go down because for me, I've always hated vulnerability. I don't think it's great. It's not fun. It's not like got vitamin C in it and stuff. So it's not one of those things that I'm like, oh, let's all be vulnerable. It's
Right.
it's a practice and it's something that I consistently have to lean back into. And
Mm.
so, yeah, I've written a couple of books. I have a podcast called the MercyCast where we deal with this idea of learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. And it's really just taken me for yeah, it's taken me for a journey. And so that's what I try to do now is help people understand their journey on as they process their own vulnerability.
That's so important. And I love how you shared that it's not something you kind of checked off, and that we can't just learn openness and vulnerability, which I think can be even two different things, but we can't
Right.
learn all of it in our hearts at once. It can be learned on how to do it. And you're going to help us with that today. But I think we all need that reminder that this is something that has washed over you a number of times. And when it almost in this realm first washed over you, it was transformative when you finally peeled back these layers, which you said very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we just run to distraction and we don't think about it. It's so easy to do.
Yes.
And in that distraction, I think we oftentimes think we can be protected from reality when the thing that's best for us is to face that thing, whatever it is.
Yes, and I am so eager to talk to you about that today. I felt a washing over of me even just a little bit this morning already with my two daughters that are probably almost out of the house at those ages of nearing college and in college. And I had a glimpse of the vulnerability, and my eyes brimmed with tears. And I was like, "Get out of here, Krista! You can't stay in this moment." But I felt so happy that I let the moment happen. And I think
Yeah.
that sometimes for some of us, as you said, it doesn't have vitamin C, so it's hard to stay there. But you're going to teach us a little bit about a few ways. Maybe you've learned to stay with it a little longer, or even approach it at all. And then also before that, though, I would love to hear about how you came to determine your Enneagram type. Yours is a type we don't often have on the show, so it's extra fun to have you today in that way.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, this is something I don't get to talk about too much because, when I first discovered it, it was like I'd been struck by lightning because I had gotten out of a long-term relationship where for some reason things just weren't working and for either side but it was primarily for me I was starting to feel like am I a bad person? Am I why can't I figure this out? And I was putting everything on me and then I studied the Enneagram and I realized my ex's type, my type and I was like, "Oh, that's why." Cuz we communicate in very different ways. And
Mhm.
it for me, it was one of those things I was like, "Oh, like, could you make it work knowing you're sure, yeah." But being completely blind and just not self-aware of that at that point, afterwards, I was like, "Oh, well, that makes so much sense. They're very, very different people, and I was communicating my way, she was communicating her way. Okay." And it was when I realized that I was a 6 on the Enneagram, a lot of things started making sense. And I remember showing some counselors or some mentors, my Enneagram, and I'm like, I don't think I'm a 6 because I didn't want to be a 6, right? I did not want to be a 6 by any means.
Mhm.
And one of my friends read it and he goes, no, it's kind of you. It's kind of spot on. And And I hated it because, like, for me, 6 was, like, the one that was I think everyone says this about their Enneagram,
They do.
unless they're 7s and then they're just too busy going to theme parks and stuff. But, like but
And that's
6
what
is
I did this weekend with my family.
of course. And it's just like, I think 6s are just fear is so much a part of the life of a 6. And we're always thinking through the worst case scenario. We're always trying to, at least the way it works it out in my life, I want to make double and triple sure before I do anything. I want God to write it in the clouds. I if I have a whiff of doubt, it will just throw me off, you know? And so for me, I want to make the right decision because one, I don't want to be hurt, but I also don't want to hurt other people. And I think a lot of 6s, we see all the angles. And so there was a joke going out around the pandemic saying that the people who were the happiest during the pandemic were 6s because we've been telling you guys this the whole time.
Isn't
We,
that true?
we've been like, I told you this was going to happen. Like I was reading the tea leaves and you all over here were just telling me to chill out, but I knew.
Yes. Mhm.
And I think for me, as like when I realized I was a 6 thing, it made a lot of sense. But then a lot of people were coming up to me and they're like, "Yeah, but I think you're an 8." Because I'm also one of those people who I am a leader and I can have strong views and like I will follow my convictions. And then I realized my subtype, which was a sexual 6, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So for me, as I've learned just understanding that maybe not everyone sees the world like me. I used to think everyone was living with fear, but I've realized no, this is my personality type. But the beauty is when you are a 6 and you are always seeing the angles and you are always realizing that the worst case scenario could happen. Like those worst case scenario books, I love. I mean, preparing for what to
Disaster.
do in a plane crash or what, those things are fantastic.
Yeah.
Like you could, they're great. But I think at the end of the day, I realized that one of the most beautiful things of my personality type is yes, fear is there, but it forces me to have courage because no one can have courage like a 6, in my opinion, because
Mm. Mm-mm.
we know how scary things are and we're going to do what we need to do anyway.
Mm.
And
Yes.
that's, yeah,
You said that so well. You're like selling 6 now, and everybody's like, "I wanna be a 6." So you went from, like, hating it, just not wanting to have that, but just really realizing, yes, there's always gonna be shadow pieces that are hard to face, but just I love that you've been able to do what I hope everyone can do when they see their gifting, to really celebrate how God wired them too. So now you see, "Oh my gosh, I never would have been able to start this platform if I didn't have all this courage, right?"
right. And I think that's where vulnerability comes in because for a 6, vulnerability is pure courage. You know, men are told that being weak is, or being vulnerable or perceived as weak is weakness. It's something to be avoided at all costs. Even when I was in seminary, we would hear from our professors never make your pulpit a confessional. Don't share too much. I mean, this idea of cultural masculinity is baptized. And basically, we're told you got to be this way, but who's making these rules, right? And I think at the end of the day, vulnerability is courage, vulnerability is strength. That could be a Copernican revolution in our thinking. That could shift everything for us if we let it.
I love that you named that with regards to the pulpit. And I think all platforms of leadership it applies to as well. And you always hear, don't get out your mess with everybody. Don't let anyone into your pain. Only work on things that are scars that are healed over. And that's troubling. Even as I wrote my newsletter this morning, I felt that. And I decided to keep a little bit of vulnerability in because I like what you just said. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I love how you said the thing about the scars because I really firmly believe that true vulnerability, and I'll preface with you don't have to be vulnerable to everyone. Be vulnerable with your safe people, be
Yes.
vulnerable with people who are bought in.
Yes.
But true vulnerability always comes at a cost. You are taking a step, you are having to be courageous. there's a lot of faux vulnerability out there that masquerades as transparency. You can see it all over social media. You can see it on TV. You could see it in the author who writes the book that sounds really good, but at the end of the day, this may be something that they've already worked through or something that's not costing them at all. And I'm not saying that's bad all the time. No way. But what I am saying is we can become manipulative with our faux vulnerability. We can use it to get other people to be honest and open with the norm of reciprocity. We can do these things to basically, yeah, manipulate others. And I think that's very dangerous. And so, yeah, I think if it's not costing you something, you have to ask why you're doing it, why you're using it, why you're saying it. Because I think true vulnerability always comes at a cost. It always comes at a sting. I think I
Mm.
think Brene Brown said it best when she calls it the vulnerability hangover. It's that moment where we share, and then the next morning or a couple hours later, I'm
Mhm.
immediately calling that person and being like, hey, man, I'm sorry if I overshared. I'm sorry if I said too much. Because
Mhm.
no one wants that feeling. And what I found is 8 times out of 10, maybe not nine, but 8 times out of 10, that person's like, no, I mean, that was really helpful. Thank you for being so open with me.
Yes.
Like, we don't want to overshare, but I think sometimes we even say, don't overshare because we want to protect ourselves from just sharing a little because we don't want to be exposed. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, I think just being exposed in the first place opens us up to the beauty of vulnerability if we're exposed in a way where we realize we weren't destroyed when someone saw our weaknesses.
Hmm. Wow. And that really makes me want to ask that question. How do you recover from the vulnerability hangover when you might regret it with a safe person, even, right? My best friend and I leave each other Voxers where we're verbal vomiting. Sometimes I will recall mine when it's not placed at least within a 15-minute range, and I'll try to make it a little shorter out of kindness, but I'll try to keep the vulnerability level. And then she'll do the same, and she'll say, you don't even have to listen to this if you don't want to at the end. We both do listen. We're like, all
Right.
right, but when you went off on that thing about your kids' soccer for 20 minutes, like that kind of sucked. And so, like, we try to reel it in a little, but like, that's pretty safe. We still feel the hangover. I guess I answered my own question in a way. You keep doing it, you try to be as thoughtful and kind as you can. But what about when you have a vulnerability hangover and it feels like it hit dead air and you feel I'm never going to do that again. That was too much and it wasn't received well.
Well, I think in those moments where we share too much and it's not received well,
Mhm.
we got to feel it. You know, we got to be in that moment and face it and be like, okay, well, that sucked. I don't ever want to do that again.
Yeah.
But what about that sucked? Like, was it what I said? Did I just get too excited and share too much? Because maybe that happened and that's okay.
Yeah.
And then if that's the case, cool. All right. So knowing what I know now, I'm not going to share with that person. I've had that situation where I thought someone was a closer friend than they were,
Mm.
or I had too much going on in my life and I was unaware of what they were processing. So I put too much on them to
Mhm.
where they didn't receive it. And so I think it really comes down to we're all in this boat. We all need to talk to people. And it's really just being not only self-aware of what you're experiencing, but also not being so self-focused that you're unaware of your surroundings and you're unaware of the people around you. Because yes, this is a stewardship. This is a gift. Our vulnerability is something we can give to others,
Mhm.
but it's also really good to be aware so that we can be aware of, are they ready to receive this gift?
Mm. Mm.
And
Yes.
that's not an excuse to not be vulnerable. It's just more of like, I think Brene Brown said this also about being vulnerable at work. She said, there's a difference between being vulnerable, this is a paraphrase, and then working your stuff out on people.
Mm. That's interesting.
And so I think being vulnerable and then basically just pushing your stuff onto people, those are two different things.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're even kind of adding that when people really are in the right space or the right person, they will steward it. And I think of one of my friends who's a therapist that when I share and leave her a Marco Polo, she's a heart type, she likes the visual. She will tell me, I watched your message 3 or 4 times before I'm responding. And that always makes me feel so loved. But it really, even more than that, helps me to be careful with what I'm saying, because you're kind of letting us know when you do share vulnerably, you might bring some emotion to that other person. So we have to do that with care, it sounds like.
One thing I tell faith communities when I work with them, or really anyone who I talk to about this, I'll say, when you're working with, say, a vulnerable population where their vulnerabilities are completely exposed, it could be someone experiencing homelessness, it could be someone who's a new immigrant to your community, it could be someone who's living with different mental health diagnoses that they're trying to process. When you face someone's explicit vulnerability, it will always uncover yours. And if you're not self aware of that, you will push them away. Like a lot of times we can push someone away and say, well, they're too much. They've got too much going on. That might be the case. Maybe there's a case for boundaries,
Yeah.
but I think more often than not, like we push people away because they remind us of our own stuff that we don't want to face. And that's why I think this idea of mutual vulnerability is the key, because when you realize my issues may be different, but I have them, that frees me to not come as a savior, but to come as a neighbor, to come as a friend, to come as just someone else who's on the journey. And I think in that moment, you're allowed to be screwed up because you realize everyone else is too.
Yeah, that's really healing to hear that. That takes us slowing down, honestly, to hear that, to be sober with it, to let it sit, to sit in the discomfort and to not let that discomfort become shame. And I know Brown talks a lot about that too. And I'm thinking of a special population that I feel like I'm relating so much with my friends, that even as kind of a handicap of a seven, because sevens are quick, fast people who don't want to sit with pain. I have been in a nurturing environment with all these women for many years. And so I've had a psychology masters, all these people sort of forcing me to do that work because I knew I needed it. But what about guys when they feel like a lot of guys are not doing this work? They're not therapists. They're not um, in the nurture that I was able to receive, and they're told, man up, don't cry, crying's for wimps. Like, how do you encourage men to sit with vulnerability?
Well, I think a lot of this comes from this cultural understanding of what masculinity is in the first place.
Mm.
And I mean, and there's a really big masculinity movement right now.
Mhm.
And with any movement, I think there is always good things and there's always bad things. But what I'm seeing with just the way I was raised was, it might have been implicit. It might not have been an explicit teaching, but it was always like, you always have to be in control. And if you're not in control, you need to look like you're in control. You need to fake it till you make it and even pretend, because if you show weakness, people will be all over you. You will
Mhm.
lose everything. You'll lose, basically, you'll lose your power. You'll lose your status. You have to always be able to project strength and dominance.
Mhm.
And so when you tell someone who's been raised and taught like that, that this is what it looks like, well, they're not going to receive that. I mean, I know that, when I wrote my book, Vulnerable, that was, that word is a turnoff to a lot of people, which is probably why my podcast, the tagline is learning the art of compassion through the adversity that we face. So when, because I use adversity and compassion, these are words that aren't as much of a trigger. But yeah, I think for men to realize that vulnerability is a strength, it requires a stripping away of a lot of what we know to be true. And a lot of this masculinity movement says that it's a biblical masculinity movement. A lot of it is grounded in, well, this is what the Bible teaches. And some of that, sure, I guess.
Mhm.
I'm not
Yeah.
100% conversant with it, but I also think that weakness is a major part of biblical masculinity. You see that in the writings of Paul. He's talking about everything that went wrong. He's talking about things that could be seen as failures. And he's saying, these are the things that make me an apostle.
Mhm.
When we picture Jesus, we're not picturing the no pain, no gain Jesus. We're picturing Jesus on a cross, crucified, unable to save him. Well, he didn't save himself. Like, so to the eyes of the world, this is a savior who was unable to save himself and he died. You
Mhm.
know, I
Mhm.
think I think Jesus is vulnerability personified.
Yeah.
Even the way he came in. I mean, he was born to a teenage mother. He was born in an inn. They didn't, or like a stable. They didn't even have,
Mhm.
or a cave, as some would say. They didn't even have space for him in the inn. He had to run as a toddler. He was a refugee. There were all these things. He was basically a blue collar worker.
Mhm.
There's all these things that connect him to us in our vulnerability and our weakness. And so it's easy to say, no, we have it all together. When Jesus, the only person who did have it all together, became like those of us who don't to save us. And I think that is biblical masculinity. I think it's this strength, being willing to face the things that we don't want to face.
Yes, that speaks to us so much. Thank you for narrating that and for being humble enough to say, sure, we talked about courage earlier. We talked about, being brave and ready to move as part of your heritage. But we are also reminded of Paul and so many scriptures flashing through my head as you said that, my weakness, God's power covers that. And also, I'm thinking our pastor's going through Moses right now and how we're always reminded of how he was so vulnerable to say, I don't want to use my voice. And so many male heroes of the Bible show that vulnerability, including Christ himself. So thank you for giving us that witness so that if guys are just being taken in too much by the reigning paradigm, they can scale back to say, hey, I want to be strong and courageous, but I never want to lose my heart. I never want to lose the reality that I am vulnerable. Thank you. That's so helpful. I know there's a lot of guys out there listening, struggling with that.
Yeah. I mean, and I get it. I get why it's a struggle because I think at some level we think that if we show who we really are or we show who we are in our weakest moments, then we'll lose what we've spent our whole life trying to gain, or we'll lose the people that we love. We feel like we have to keep this strong face. And if these people truly love us, oftentimes oftentimes our vulnerability will take them by surprise, but in a different way. Like they'll be like, wow, you've grown. Thank you for sharing that with me. And then your friendship will grow or your relationship will grow.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really good. And I do see that with male friendships getting, and obviously females too, but I do see that when I see my husband connect with men on a deep dive way over years. Sometimes he'll push for years in a gentle way, but then years later, they're like, hey, I'm going through a divorce. I'm going through something tough. It's happened again and again and again. And when you share vulnerably, people may not even respond right away, but it may take a lot of time, I think, for men particularly. I've seen it that way where it's like 2, 3, 4 years of pouring in vulnerability, even just a little bit. My husband's not a particularly vulnerable type, but just a little bit. If you guys can grow out there and share a little bit, just take another step out, just like I did this morning with my girls. Like, if you're struggling, I think that's a good word. What else would you say to men, women? There are people of every personality type, but I think fours are amazing usually at going deep. But to the rest of us, what would you say if we're just wanting that next step of being healthily vulnerable?
Well, I would say that to be healthily vulnerable, and this is something that I have learned the hard way,
Mm.
and I've had mentors who've kind of addressed it with me to where I was not self-aware of the fact that when I started the vulnerability journey, I was probably more vulnerable than I needed to be.
Mhm.
with more people than I needed to be
Mm.
and with people who hadn't earned it. And what I found is if I'm the one who's being vulnerable all the time and the other person's not reciprocating at all,
Mhm.
then that relationship is costing me a lot, but
Mhm.
it's that other person's not as bought in. And that can burn you. And I think when we've had experiences like that where you finally get to that point where I'm going to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
but then you're vulnerable to the wrong person and you're like, I will never be vulnerable
Correct.
again. It's like
Correct.
that Wham song, I'm never going to dance again. My guilty feet have gotten a rhythm. It's like we feel that way with our vulnerability. It's just like,
Mhm.
I'm never going to be vulnerable again. I can't, I don't, I'm not ever going to do it. I'm just going to lock up. And that's fine. But when you do that, you're actually imprisoning yourself. Your walls become your prison. And so I think what's important is be authentic with everyone. Be you with everyone, even if it's a little offbeat, even if it's a little weird, even if you're a little awkward, just be you. But be vulnerable with the few. Be vulnerable with the people who are vulnerable with you, who you have taken time to get to know, where you both deem each other as safe, where they can see you on your best day and your worst day and still love you. I have friends where when I have completely fallen on my face for things that I've done, whether it's reacting out of past trauma or whatever, I've completely fallen on my face. And there are certain people that didn't leave. Now, there were a lot of people who were friends who didn't stick around.
Mhm. Yeah.
But when I realized the people that didn't leave, those are the people that I keep going back to. Those are the people that I believe have earned it. And it's generally the people who they may not say a ton, but I know that they've been vulnerable with me. And so I think as you're about to share something intense about yourself or something that is coming at a cost, ask yourself, is the person I'm sharing with bought in? Are they genuinely interested in my life? Do they love me? And if you can't answer that question affirmatively, then maybe take a moment, take a breath, and rather than sharing with them, don't share just because it's on deck. Like don't share just because you feel like you have to.
Yeah.
Wait to share with the right person because I've experienced it. Like when the moments where I have the vulnerability hangover and I realize, oh no, that's gonna burn me. And then I call the person, I'm like, please don't ever share what I shared with you to anybody, please. And they're like,
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah.
And everyone will say that they won't. Everyone will say, no, you can say anything to me. That's just not true. And so finding the people who you know beyond a shadow of a doubt are safe people who they share with you, you share with them, and it's a lockbox. Be brutally honest and vulnerable with them. With everyone else, be authentic and be you and see if that relationship can grow.
Good. Yes. And even between the lines, I hear you saying people are going to be weeded out in that way, not out of love, not out of authenticity, perhaps not even out of co outreach or ministry or work, but just out of that inner circle. They are going to be weeded out of that. And that's okay because, as I lamented earlier last week on the podcast, I was having too many friend issues that I had a dream where two friends were fighting over. One of them came to surprise me, and I didn't have enough to give to both, which is a common seven sort of a dream. Overwhelm, right? Like I took on too much. But I think that I was lamenting a man of too many friends comes to ruin because I was realizing what you're saying, that if you're going to have these kinds of vulnerable relationships, you can't really have too many because they take time. They take listening, they take a piece of your heart. And so you have to, it's a good weeding out, in other words.
Yeah. And I think when you weed out, you're not throwing people to the side, but you're realizing that
Definitely.
you can't make someone be who you want them to be. And some of your friends, they're just your buddies
Hmm.
that you're going to watch the game together. You're going to go hunting. They're
Yeah.
not going to be someone that you share deep things with. And I've learned that the hard way.
Mm.
And, And sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you think you're closer to someone than you are. That's okay. You learn, you face it, and you say, all right, that didn't go the way I wanted to. Next time, I'm going to approach it a little differently. I'm not going to close up, but I'm going to find the people who are more attuned to what I'm looking for. And I think that's okay.
That's really good. And thank you for reminding us not to close up or close off those other relationships, but just allow for the vulnerable ones to be a little different and be a little deeper. And even I like how earlier today you said, give people who aren't there yet a little space because that might be a growth moment for them where they saw that you were vulnerable. Then you pull back just a little bit and they realize, oh, I maybe lost an opportunity to be close with that person. So they might decide to stretch, but what we're not doing is that word vomit we talked about earlier, where you're forcing people into your story, forcing them into your trauma, forcing them to
Right.
move on.
Yeah. Yeah. You're actually giving them the choice. I think that's such a great way to say it. Like what you just said of you're giving them the space to where if they realize, oh, well, he's not being as honest with me anymore and he's not being as transparent, I want to see if I can meet him. That's a different thing than basically forcing someone to be your vulnerability partner without their consent. I mean, because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
vulnerability is it's really a pathway to intimacy. And if people aren't ready to receive intimacy or have that connection with another person, like you can't force it. That's not right. It's not okay.
Mhm.
Because at that point, it becomes your and I don't think we think about it, but you're kind of using that person for your own thing without thinking about what they need.
Yes. Yeah. There's a selfishness to it, which we're allowed to love ourselves. But you're reminding us if we're just always sharing our stuff, always dumping on people, really notice or a certain person that's not responsive, like they may have something going on right now. They may not be the person. In fact, there may be a boundary you're crossing that isn't okay. So that gives us permission when people are really vulnerable with us and we're not able to accept that, that we can also set our boundaries as needed, right?
Yeah, and I think that idea of giving ourselves permission is so clutch because when we say, okay, so I can't be this person's solution. I mean, I've had friends who were going through really difficult situations where I'm like, I'm not in a place to walk hand in hand with you, but do you have a counselor that you can call? I can be your friend and we can talk, but I'm not your therapist in this moment. I can't be. I don't have the capacity. And so I think for me in those moments, it's the job of me as a friend is to make sure that that person has someone that they can go to who can really help them while also knowing my own boundaries and my own capacity in that moment. Because I know because I've done it, you've probably done it too, to where you dive in and deep down you're kind of running on fumes and you're not going to be good for that person.
Right. Hmm.
I, I had a coach once who apologized to me for giving me advice that it didn't go over well. And he was like, you know what? I shouldn't have even taken the call. I was going through my own things.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
like, and for me, that modeled so much because I was like, yeah, like he, he was like, even what I said, he's like, I went back over what I said. He's like, I wouldn't have said it had I felt better.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so I think in those moments, it's basically saying, I'm your friend. I'm not going anywhere. Let's keep talking. But I think the person you need to do the lion's share of this with is a licensed counselor.
Hmm.
It's someone who can really help you navigate this because I don't think I will be able to. And it's not like self-loathing to say
Hmm.
what your boundaries and your capacity is
Hmm. Thank you for
or
saying that.
are.
Yeah. I think sometimes the voice of shame will come at us. So thanks for adding that, that when we set the boundary or when we're too vulnerable or get rejected, I've had it all. I've had it, like you said, where I've maybe shared advice that was when I was in a weak space right after losing a parent or something, or, in a hard moment maritally or something like that. I can remember even coming back a little too soon after my dad passed, and my mom had already passed, and I was able to later reflect on that with another therapist who lost a parent and say, give yourself a little more time than I gave, because I think that, I brought that into my work a little too much at that time. And, similarly, I've had people tell me, you've shared a little too much, or nonverbals have told me that. And I've been the one to tell people too, I'm not going to be able to be your coach or therapist here. That happens to me all the time in my field. And so I think that when we give ourselves permission, sometimes that voice of shame does rush up to us, and we just have to continue to remember the love of Christ over us, and that He has not given us that spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind, so that we can say, "Look, I'm human. Sometimes the weakness shows, and I really do love these people, but this is not mine to hold. I'm going to allow myself some Sabbath here, some rest, some respite." Honestly, usually for many of us probably listening, and we ourselves at times, sometimes our bodies will viscerally say no. Like, you're going to have a panic moment. You're going to be off. You're just going to feel weird, dissociated, whatever each type does. I'm thankful in a way. It's hard, but when our bodies sort of rise up to tell us no, right?
Well, yeah, and what you said, I think, is so important for us because at this point, we're talking about being vulnerable with other people. But when people are vulnerable with us, there's a cost there too.
Mhm.
And when people are sharing their stuff with us, that can be that can be really heavy. And I might butcher this phrase,
Mhm.
but the proverb that says, "Bear your burdens with one another," basically says next that everyone must bear their own burden,
Mm.
or something to that effect. I know I'm butchering it, but there's this idea of yes, we are to share our burdens with everyone, but ultimately they're bearing their burdens. And I think what's important is if you're going to share things with people and they're going to be vulnerable with you, you really need to lean into like, do I have someone that I can talk to? I love how you, as a counselor, you're saying, well, when I was meeting with these other counselors, you're not acting like you had it all together. When I started as a pastor early on, I remember saying things like, I don't need to go to counseling because I'm a pastor. I'm the one who counsels.
Right.
But I wasn't prepared. And I think if we're working with people or trying to care for people, we have to have people caring for us. We have to have people who are seeing the ugly sides of us. And I hate that. I
Yeah.
despise that. That's the worst. But you have to have that because there's a cost for everything for the people that are working with you and the people that you're working with. And so we really have to balance that if we're going to be effective.
Yes, thank you for that distinguishing, just to all the pastors and therapists and coaches listening, that you need that too. You're so much better for your people. You protect them better when you do that work of support for you. And I also hear you saying it's okay to have this moment where you realize even they can't hold it all. You need to do your work. And I just happened to finish Proverbs recently in my Bible study, and it was, it's a reminder, don't be in your neighbor's house constantly, or they'll get irritated with you too. Like, you can't always be at your best friend or whoever, your counselor, your coach. And I have that sometimes with a few different temperaments with clients, that I have to set a little more boundaries, because I realize they're going to be the ones to come after me a bit more. And I could be exhausted by just one person when there might be 30 that need me. So I think that's important that we remember that, and I can exhaust others too, not just them with me. But also, lastly, on this point, I think that when we go to Christ, we're a little less asking of others. So that might be something for all of us to consider in our vulnerability too, right? Is how are you taking some time to really be with Christ, to really listen, to really pray? And before we end, or as we end, do you have any recommendations for that on how we might unburden ourselves a little more toward Him?
Yeah, I think that is always something to be self-aware of is am I taking things to others that I could be taking to God in prayer? And ideally, it might be the best approach would be if we can train ourselves to say, okay, my anxiety is a backwards prayer. I'm thinking about this, I'm just not pointing it the right direction.
Mm,
And so doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It means that, okay, like, because a lot of us think, and I'm one of these people, I, I don't think to pray, but I can think to worry. And so, what would it look like if we were able to just say, God help me. I'm stressed out right now. God help me. I'm scared. God help me use my words
mm,
and give them to you. And then go to other people and say, I've been praying about this, but this is where I'm at. Because, you know, he's that friend that sticks closer than a brother. He's that person that will not abandon you. He will not forsake you. He will not leave you. He's not going to run when you overshare. In fact, we see it modeled in the Psalms that as we pray to God, we should be a little much. We should share the nasty things. We should share our anger and our frustration
mm,
and just not be polished because he doesn't want the part of us that we project. He died for the real us, and he's here to save the real you, the you that doesn't test well, the you that
mhm.
struggles with optics, the you that will be abandoned if everyone knows your stuff and your struggles.
Yeah.
God won't do that. And so I think going to him is ultimately the thing that will prepare you to care for others. And then when we realize that we're loved like that, when we realize that we are loved with this unquenching, unafraid love, that this truly vulnerable love, that this person's not going anywhere, that starts to transform us little by little. That starts to change us into people who love other people differently, people who love people even though they aren't kind. I'm I'm talking with an author who wrote a book on mental illness, and this person came to know Jesus because he was invited to a birthday party, and he looked at everyone and he said, "I'm kind of a jerk. Why are you being so nice to me?"
My goodness.
And they're like, "Well, it's because Jesus has changed our lives." And I think that's the beauty. I think that's the thing. I think his name is Chris Morris.
That's cool.
Incredible author. But yeah, that's the beauty of when people have been changed, it will change how they interact with other people. And so I think that's the encouragement is don't only go to Jesus because you should, but go to Jesus because he made himself vulnerable for you. So you know you can trust him with your vulnerability.
Mm. Mm. That is so good. Thank you so much, Raleigh. This has been an amazing conversation. And I know our listeners are like, okay, where do I get a hold of Raleigh? I need to get to his podcast and to learn more from him and your books. And now I want to read your book on vulnerability. So tell us more about where we can find you.
Yes. So you can find the podcast at MercyCast.com. And my book, Vulnerable Rethinking Human Trafficking, is available online wherever you want to buy it. And yeah, you can find out more about my organization, Let My People Go, at lmpg, like letmypeoplego.org. And yeah, I would love to work with you and help you on your journey.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. We so appreciate this.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful you hung out with us today. This was indeed a rich conversation. As you can hear from Raleigh being a 6, he's kind of like a brother to me on the Enneagram, right? We're so close in that thinking space. And yet the courage of the 6 really shone out. It's different. It's so fascinating to see each partner of just this world. And in this case, the body of Christ, but in the world at large with our gifts shining out. And his is just so apparent. So I hope you'll check him out at the MercyCast, read his book where he's vulnerable about himself and how he came into his vision for human trafficking help, and so much more. So you can check him out in all the show notes and at RaleighSadler.com, Instagram, the book, and the pod. All right. Have a great day. I will look forward to talking to you this midweek. Okay. Bye bye.